Good morning. Thanks to everyone for joining this morning's webinar. No doubt many of you couldn't wait to finish your weekends so you could kickstart your week with a nuanced conversation on regulatory processes. So thank you for thank you for your eager enthusiasm. No, all jokes aside, regulatory approvals for power plants has sort of gone from an issue that was very much at the periphery of the industry, sort of almost like necessary nuisance in some ways that had rooms for streamlining and improvement 5, 10+ years ago, to now being right at the forefront of concerns on reliability, costs, both to generators as well as what's passed on to consumers, as well as an issue set that's right at the nexus of the energy transition and the implications therein. So to set the stage a little bit here, the regulatory approval domain has really kind of blown up here in the last few years, where we're seeing in some areas like Texas, you have efficient processes where you can still get power plants developed in, say, 2 to 3 years. But in most other regions of the United States, regulatory approval processes are preventing many power plants from ever coming online and getting developed. And those that do oftentimes face upwards of a decade just for the approval processes. So this is becoming a major concern going forward. And perhaps the best way to subdivide the issue set is into two bins. The first is permitting and siting, which is, of course, both the federal and state issue. And then the other is generator interconnection. Today, we're going to focus a bit more on the latter because we know many of our stakeholders are quite familiar with the former, and there's been some good work done on it recently. Now, the good news is that this summer, Congress, of course, passed some legislation that was incrementally beneficial on the permitting front. And this summer, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, issued Order 2023, which quite similarly was often characterized as an incremental improvement to generator interconnection processes. But as many of the industry is finding out here, it's kind of left the heavy lifting unaddressed, unnecessary reforms. So everyone in the industry is sort of reconvening in this very timely and relevant discussion to figure out how do we get these outstanding permitting and generator interconnection reforms across the finish line. And so with that, we've got a very distinguished panel here today of researchers and practitioners who can speak to these issues, both technically as well as sort of the procedural options that are on the table. To start off with, we have Karen Honoran. She's the president and CEO of ELCON, which is the National Trade Association for Industrial Energy Consumers. So welcome, Karen. We're really excited to, in particular, hear the consumer perspective on this issue set. We also then have on the producer side, Arnie Quinn. Arnie is the senior vice president at Vistra. And prior to joining Vistra, he was the policy director at FERC. So he brings both a great deal of institutional knowledge as well as his current practitioner insights into what developers go through with these processes. Next, we'll have Casey Kelly, who's a senior research associate with the ClearPath Foundation. ClearPath focuses on an innovation-heavy approach to addressing a lot of our clean energy and climate needs. So welcome, Casey. And last, but certainly not least, we have our Street's very own Beth Garza. Beth's been with us for a few years and has been very technically engaged on issues, including generator interconnection. Prior to joining us, she used to be the independent market monitor for ERCOT, which is the grid operator for most of Texas. And as mentioned, Texas is a bit of a positive outlier on this issue set. So we'll be learning a lot more about kind of comparing and contrasting some approaches there. So before we jump right into the panel, just a couple quick run of show items for folks. First off, you'll notice, I think we did put in the chat there that this is being recorded. So don't worry if you want to go back and fact check something or perhaps over the holidays, sit down with friends and family, commiserate over, interconnection queue reform. You're more than welcome to go back into the archives and do so. Secondly, you've noticed that this event is 90 minutes, whereas we usually do 60 minutes. The thinking here is that for interconnection in particular, It's a very tricky subject matter area. We have a lot of attendees today with varied backgrounds. Some folks are kind of coming into this issue set fresh. Others are sort of like the seasoned industry vets that really want to dig into the sticky issues. So we want to make sure that we sort of have enough time to build up at the 101, 201, 301 level very quickly in the first 45 to 60 minutes here, and then really reserve the last half hour to really ratchet up a notch. We're going to sort of start off with a bit more of the problem statement, the policy landscape, high level categorical policy directions going forward. And then in that last bit, we'll dig into things a bit in a bit more detail. We will be taking audience Q&A in about 45 minutes from now. The first round, again, we'll emphasize it a bit more for clarifying or basic questions, major policy takeaways, things like that. And then a lot more of the nuanced stuff we'll get into in the second part. Sound good? All right. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth, who has the very fun and challenging task in a couple minutes explaining what the heck generator interconnection is, walk us through some of the basics, how these mechanics work, and setting the stage for our discussion today. Thank you.
Very good. So as someone who's been in the electricity space for a very, very long time, I know that electricity, just as a discussion topic and policy, is complicated for non-insiders. I will say that anything related to transmission, the transmission portion of the electricity space, is the most complicated part of it. And that's because electricity is, you can think of it as a phenomenon. I do at times. It's a phenomenon. And what is the grid? The grid is an interconnected bit, a bunch of wires connected to supply sources. And the magic of it is the operations and planning and control of that system that allows all of those pieces to work together reliably and to maintain that service even when pieces sort of unexpectedly disappear. They're forced out for some reason. So with that as a very basic groundwork, what is interconnection? Interconnection has, I think of it in two stages, if you will, or two pieces, two things to think about. One is the physical connection of where's that power plant or that supply source connecting to the wires themselves. And there's some facilities, there's some equipment that's necessary to make that connection. There's also the other more challenging process is once that are connecting that supply source to the system, you then have a question of whether its output can be reliably delivered anywhere. And we tend to think of those two different aspects as one is the sort of the pure interconnection. Can I reach out with my jumper cables and connect to the wires? And what are the impacts of doing that? And then what generally referred to as network upgrades necessary to reliably inject or reliably absorb that electricity into the system. One of the challenges are there are no real clear or universal criteria for what does it mean to reliably absorb that electricity. And that's one of the challenges and one of the different regional differences we see is as to what that means and what necessary or what upgrades are necessary to accommodate that. I'll also, as part of our basic introduction here, just remind everyone we had a major order from FERC this year, Order 2023, which is hopefully named, so we'll remember it into the future. And that order addressed interconnection and it took the first steps, I guess is the best way to say that. And it required some, I would suggest, pretty simple or pretty straightforward first steps in that process for all RTOs and just transmission providers to adopt. I'll say that most of the ISOs already do a lot of those introductory kinds of things that were in Order 2023. So in terms of that order being a groundswell or causing a massive change, and the solution to what we've seen is a pretty big logjam of generation projects trying to interconnect. We're still waiting for sort of the next best solution, or the next good solution to try to break up that logjam. And I think those are some of the things that we'll get into in this discussion. Is, yes, Order 2023 was good. It moves in the right direction, but there's more to be done. And I think across this panel, we may have some different ideas on what the more to be done is. So with that, I'll leave that as our introduction to the topic this morning.
Thank you, Beth, and certainly foreshadowing the next round of questioning on what's to be done. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Casey, who's done some research and in particular did a great paper, I think it was about a year ago, right, Casey, called All Queued Up, that really focused on aspects of really like defining a lot of the problem statement quite nicely for this issue and outlining some of the implications of it. So Casey, I'd be curious if you could kind of shed some light on your research on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely, and greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here today and for Beth to provide that foundational knowledge. So I think to kind of contextualize and provide some scale to the challenge, I'll quickly go into, what was happening last year before FERC had this Order 2023 put out. And so what the interconnection process looked like was a first come, first served basis, where everybody or every project that wanted to connect to the grid was assessed as an individual. And so what that process looked like was you would go to your transmission provider, either the utility or your RTO, and you would request interconnection service. You would then undergo a 3-phase study, at the end of which you would be told how much it would cost to connect your project to the grid, and you would sign an agreement that include those costs and some timeline on what those upgrade construction timelines would look like. And so some of the features of this process that made it so backlogged and broken was that first you had shrinking transmission capacity on the system, which meant that certain areas, when you connected, there's lots of capacity. So the cost of those network upgrades that Beth talked about, very low and non-existent. But in some other areas of the system, those costs to connect were extremely high, sometimes as high as 40% of a project's overall cost ended up being for those interconnection upgrades. And so that cost of interconnection really has an impact on the economic viability of your project. But there were not a lot of ways besides requesting interconnection at different points on the grid to essentially discover what those prices would be. And so, and one feature of how those costs are allocated is if you request to interconnect and it's a high cost, you would pay for it as that individual project, but then other projects behind you next in line could be connecting and benefiting from the upgrade that you paid for, but not contributing to the cost. And so there's very much this incentive for projects to put in a lot of requests to discover where those cheap prices were, or kind of get that luck of the draw and be that next in line project that benefits from this new upgrade without paying for it. And so this kind of alignment of incentives resulted in this, the growing amount of projects requesting to interconnect that maybe weren't all viable, known as speculative projects, or projects would withdraw and then cause restudies to occur because the projects no longer on the system, so the system conditions that they were studied under changed. And this really created a massive backlog, escalating the amount of time projects spend in the queue. So projects built in 2022 took on average 5 years from when they requested interconnection to commercial operation. If you go back to 2015, that was 3 years. If you go back to 2008, that was 2 years. So the amount of time projects are spending in the queue has grown significantly, as well as the amount of projects that actually make it to commercial operation is now less than 25%. So when you think about what we need to build out for decarbonizing the grid and meeting our decarbonization targets, we know that all these leading models are projecting, doubling of the grid. The amount of projects we add in a single year for many of these is double what the historical maximum is. And when you take into account the completion rates being less than 25%, you actually need a 7-fold increase in the amount of projects that are actually in the pipeline in order to actually get out what you would need to meet those targets. And so it's creating a real challenge for all of our clean energy deployment goals. And also when you factor in this timeline issue, you would need to have all the projects you wanted to connect this decade already in the queue or in the queue within the next year in order for that to be realistically coming online. Which when we talk about some of these reliability issues, you have a significant mismatch between what is projected to retire, what the load growth is going to need, and what you can feasibly put on the grid in that time frame. And so what Order 2023 did was recognize that this was a massive issue. It needed a holistic approach. But unfortunately, as we've alluded to, it very much raised the floor, but did not break the ceiling on what we needed. It was not transformational. It took many of the best practices around the country, but we see in those places where the best practices are adopted in MISO, in California, they're still trying to identify break the glass procedures and caps on the amount of projects that can even apply to the queue. You have PGM put a pause for multiple years on accepting any new request. So in many ways, Order 2023 raised the floor, but did not break the ceiling on this process. And so that is why this is such a big challenge for reliability, for consumers, which other panels will get into more, as well as for clean energy deployment.
Thanks, Casey. That's an excellent overview and setup of the problem statement here. I'll also note for a lot of our audience, there's also some additional research out there by the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory that's done some good work. And one of the ways that they phrased it when Casey was talking about the restudies and the backlogs and all the incentives for extra queue requests that then exacerbate the problem, they kind of characterize it as a wicked problem. And I think it sort of is, because there's no single one policy lever that you pull that fixes everything. There's an interconnected set of policies. So important for all of us and policymakers and influencers of policymakers to understand that context. So I want to pivot now more over to the practitioner perspective and maybe start off with Arnie here, because it's quite obvious that generator interconnection is a generator problem. So I would love to just kind of hear, Arnie, how does the commercial landscape unique to Vistra, or even more broadly, kind of view generator interconnection problems? What are the issues you're having, and sort of how do you see sort of the new business as usual post Order 2023 playing out?
Yeah, no, Devin, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'll say a couple things. One, just that timeline problem that Casey has talked about and Beth outlined. Where that really hits you is your project economics change. If it's a 2-year time frame, even 2 years, you've got to make some assumptions about the cost of panels or the cost of batteries, and that can change. The longer you spend in the queue, the more change that occurs, the more difficult it is for you to order things ahead of time, like transformers right now. Transformers take a long time to order, like 3 years. So when do you order it? It's very expensive. So, I'll say that's just the timing really complicates the economics of any project and can fundamentally change things. The other thing I'll say is, as a developer of new projects, you want some way to signal that you're one of the serious ones. So I think Casey and Beth did a nice job of talking about these speculative projects. Sometimes it is just not just I'm going to put 8 different projects in because I don't know where it's good to interconnect. Sometimes it is I'm 2 guys on a laptop. And I have hopes and dreams, but none of those projects are going to come through. As a sophisticated developer, you want some way to signal I'm one of the serious ones. And Order 2023, in part, did that by just raising the deposits. So you got to put more money up on the front end. For a company like Vistra, that works fairly well. we're, again, big balance sheet. That's something that we can do. Everyone needs to understand what that means is for a smaller company, you're just going to take some kinds of companies and make it much more difficult for them to operate. So if we could find some way to make the serious companies, the serious projects, signal that in a reliable, credible way, and still kind of keep the set of companies capable or willing to develop as large as possible, those would be the kinds of transformative policies that really help.
Perfect. Thanks for teeing that up and offering that perspective. And I think it's also important on the producer side too, that we often need to recognize that this affects any type of power plant development right now. There's been a lot of questions about whether it affects this fuel class or this technology class more than others. And there are perhaps some geographic differences between the requirements and the network upgrades that you do see between fuel classes. But it's important to note that all classes of technology that are under development have to go through this process. And so it's something across the board that we really need to see, that we see developers of all types of fuel and technology classes being concerned with. And with that, I want to turn it over to Karen to offer the consumer perspective, especially in context of oftentimes people think about this as a certain class of generator problem. But as we've been seeing more and more the last couple of years, the reliability consequences of the backlog or the cost consequences, et cetera, are ultimately being passed along to elevating this issue as a serious consumer concern. So Karen, as sort of both with your sort of industrial consumer hat on and sort of just all your technical insight in the industry and engaging with the broader consumer movement, how do you tee this issue up from a consumer perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Devin, and thank you, R Street, for the invitation. And of course, this is a wonky topic, and it's like, why did the consumers care? But there really is enormous reliability and cost challenges with this, just in the timing. Time is money, and these are resources that are very much needed on the grid. We are at a point in our history where we have, for the first time in a long time, load growth, especially with large industrials. We're seeing a huge push to bring manufacturing operations back to U.S. shores. And so large industrial consumers are looking to expand their operations, to, build more plants to manufacture, whether it's whatever product they're making. And so we're going to need that much more energy. And these are very energy intensive operations. And so we really need that reliable service. And of course, cost being the other issue. And again, and I think Casey alluded this to a bit, we're seeing a mismatch in the timing of generation retirements. These are your typical coal plants, other plants that are perhaps older and not as economical as perhaps they used to be. We're also seeing the proliferation of renewables. But we see this mismatch. And one of the reasons in the sort of the timing that is not lining up is that, there are certain policy pressures that are perhaps requiring some generation to retire early. And then we need that much more back on the grid to replace those energy services. A lot of that is renewable, that because they're meeting those goals and just because that is the direction the country is going in. But we need that much more to replace existing, perhaps 24/7 base load. You need even more renewables to replace that. And a lot of that, if you look at the interconnection queues, not that I think that many people go in there and look at those, there is just probably between 75, 85, 90% of that queue is renewable generation. So we desperately need those resources to get online. But as we've heard, it could take years. And these retirements are happening now. And so we need those resources here now to reliably provide power and at a cost that is economical and can be borne by customers, because all of this, any inefficiencies, any sort of escalation in these costs, these do get passed down to consumers. And so we really need to make some sort of regulatory and operational efficiency to make sure that we're keeping that balance of retirements and new replacement generation, so that we are maintaining reliability and we're doing it in a cost-effective way. And so while 2023 did go to a certain extent, putting together clusters, trying to study groups of projects that sort of make sense together to sort of spread those costs among multiple generators, like Casey said, and that was a great analogy, that it brought the floor up, but it didn't break the ceiling. So we are still looking at years and years before a lot of these resources are even able to connect. And we just really do not have the time to allow an inefficient process as we are transforming so rapidly. So we want to see a little bit more aggressive looks at how to make this work so that we can reliably and cost effectively provide energy for our consumers, and especially for us as industrials. We really are looking to expand, and we need those assurances that we can do this in an economical way and a reliable way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. To put a bow on one aspect of the problem statement too, Karen got into talking about like what class of resources and sort of a volume is affected here, and you heard a bit more from that volume from Casey too. It's important to recognize that the United States is predominantly building renewable storage and natural gas development. Now, when you look at the sheer volume of what's in there, a lot of times you do see just on a sort of nominal capacity basis, over 90% is renewables. But to Karen's point, each region does this a bit differently, but there's sort of an adjusted like a capacity accreditation process, or sort of making sure that whatever fraction of that fuel class is actually firm and deliverable on a system. So for example, Beth and I were looking at this for PJM, the biggest grid operator here recently, and less than 10% of that, over 90% actually of that was more renewables or these hybrid and storage type resources. Less than 10% was natural gas. But again, because natural gas provides that firming aspect too, when you make those adjustments, what we actually saw was that the queues were actually backlogging about a third of the firm capacity was natural gas. So it's important for folks to realize we have to account for completion rates, the motives behind a lot of these queue requests, as well as like thinking about how that translates into firm power, because that's your reliability implication. And again, going back to the point of like, this is really becoming an issue set for consumers and across all types of generator classes that are under development. So with that, let's dig into the fun aspect of like, what are we going to do about this? So we've got a sense of what the new business as usual is, sort of in the order 2023 world. Perhaps I'll start off in roughly the same order here. What categorically, what policy reform bins do we need to really prioritize to move this forward and address really the pain points in outstanding interconnection reform? Over to Beth.
So I think starting with kind of the requirement to the term of art is do a cluster analysis, right? The goal would be, well, if I've got 10 projects that are all kind of in the same region, and as long as they're, we connect them to the wires they're close to, and then we think about, well, what are the network upgrades necessary to support that? It's going to be, it's kind of the same stuff. And that cluster analysis is a good starting point, because it sets the, it sets a group, if you will. And so part of the challenge is, well, how do you define that group? And I know Arnie has something he wants to say on that here in a minute. How do you define that group? And then are you then allocating costs across that group? Part of the challenge is then going to be, do you have penalties for withdrawal from that group? How do you keep that group that you've assigned and you're studying, how do you keep it together? How do you, and it would be nice, again, these are when we talk about these transmission studies, it would be nice if we could evolve to push a button, answer comes out kind of evaluation that could be performed by transmission companies. Maybe there are some things that can be done to improve that, the process itself, whether that's more consistency of data on the front end, or automation of the process. That, for me, who has some hands-on history of trying to deal with that, I have a hard time seeing that, but that's just because I'm old, and I'm hopeful that, you know, the next wave here is going to figure out how to do that. But that's the kind of process, or the kind of evolution that we need to be open to and sort of driving toward, I think, is the best way to think about it. It's the data management necessary to perform these studies. And Casey alluded to it, there's a series of studies that are increasingly complicated as you move through the process. So at an initial phase, if we could do that sort of quickly and easily, like within I'd say days, not months, right? If we could drive ourselves to that kind of process, that would help with that initial screening and potentially kind of filter out some of the noise, and better able you to kind of establish what a group is, and how to establish what the next, what the bigger upgrades might be necessary for that group. Let me stop there. There's lots of other things to talk about, but let me stop there with just sort of the data and the grouping processes and how that could be improved going forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Beth. And I think I'll circle back to here in the next round with some sort of, what does Texas do differently and why? But before we do that, over to Casey. Casey, what do you see as many of the outstanding sort of policy reform categories?
Yeah, so as Beth mentioned, we went from a serial process, so individually assessing projects and sending them to a cluster-based process. And to what Arnie said, like, we're increasing the deposit amounts that projects need in order to get into and through the queue, increase the withdrawal penalties to really deter projects from coming out of the queue and causing those restudies. There's also different commercial readiness and site control requirements that are meant to really weed out the speculative projects. So FERC implemented a lot of reforms that are really meant to, make sure that whoever's going into the queue is going to stay throughout the entire process to prevent these withdrawals and these further delays. There's also the cost allocation piece. So prorating the cost of the studies based on the number of projects and size of the projects, as well as allocating the cost for network upgrades to something that's a proportional impact method, is what they call it. So if your project is causing less of the need for an upgrade, like your payment for that will be adjusted compared to another project in the queue that might be causing a greater need. So those are some of the cost disincentives that are no longer there to prevent kind of this speculative drafting attempt by some of the interconnection customers. And one of the big changes from Order 2023 is also affected system studies. So you have your transmission provider, so the footprint and the area of the grid that you want to plug into where your project is located. But as Beth said, that the grid spans the entire country. You have neighboring regions where your project might potentially have an impact on their system. And so before Order 2023, there was no standards. There was for coordinating between your transmission provider and your neighbor, your affected system. And so I think one of the most significant changes that Order 2023 has achieved is that there's now an established process, a communication protocol that must be set up for projects in affected system studies. There's now expectations and accountability there. And so really getting at some of those, that black box of what's going on in your neighbor's interconnection queue, let alone what's going on in your interconnection queue. And so I think those are one of those significant changes is really establishing and having accountability between the transmission interconnection processes across regions. And then also you have information access. So MISO's, again, had a map on their website kind of showing where interconnection capacity availability is. And now FERC is requiring all interconnection areas to display that map so that projects can get a better sense before they even enter the queue where they might want to be siting their projects. And so again, deterring speculative projects from entering the queue. And so I think a lot of these information access, just broader transparency and accountability into processes should be helpful. And I think more room can be done there in terms of, what information, what tools are accessible outside of the queue so that developers can better understand what projects and what locations are going to be viable. And so you have less speculative projects entering the queue.
Wonderful. Yeah, sunshine is a great disinfectant for what's actually motivating the flood of all these requests, right? And we know that there remains some work to be done there. And Casey, thanks for bringing up a lot of the systems studies too, because we do know that the black box there can be very convoluted, and there's a variety of different transmission technologies out there now. It's not just the conventional technologies available that we can utilize to upgrade these systems more cost effectively and much more expeditiously than we could in past years. Perhaps that's something Arnie and Karen can dig in a little bit more on too. So Arnie, over to you.
Yeah, and I think I can build on what Beth and Casey have talked about. So, on the speculative process or speculative project issues, Casey mentioned commercial readiness, and that was a question that FERC raised in Order 2023. And one way to do that, and this was the way that FERC originally proposed, was to require some PPA, some power purchase agreement ahead of the process. And I think we, Vistra, and every developer we knew really had grave concerns about that, because it's a chicken and egg. So no one wants to sign a PPA with us unless they know for sure that we're going to be able to get interconnected, and we have a sense of what the cost of that is going to be. And so we can't get a PPA before we get through the interconnection process. So asking us to have a PPA before we even get in line just doesn't work. It's clear why people want to do something like this, because you do want to make sure that project is real. I think the other thing that we worry a lot about with the commercial readiness that requires a PPA is it provides a real advantage to self-build. So the utility self-build is way easier, because you say, well, my PPA is with myself, so let me get in front of line. Our idea, and I think this is maybe an and rather than an or, so it's something you could do in addition to what's being done today, is stealing from the merchant transmission business. So there's already a business for really long transmission lines that take resource-rich areas, bring it to load. And the way that is done, and there's not a ton of these projects, but the way that is done is someone does an open season. They ask for expressions of interest. People either express interest or not, but once there's a critical mass, then they can start moving forward with a project. But if you're expressing interest, you're a serious project. And once you've gotten far enough down the line, really the projects and the line developer are essentially partners. Both business depends on the others kind of getting all the way to the finish line. We like that as a possible way to kind of push the interconnection process forward. So if you could identify areas where there's a lot of development, or development interest at least, group those studies together, identify what the network backbone is needed, maybe identify other benefits. So maybe there are some kind of societal benefits that should be where some portion of the cost should be socialized. But then whatever cost is left over for the interconnection customers, then allow people to express interest. If you get more interest than you expected, then go back and see whether you could right size that project. And Devin, that's where I think maybe some of these new technologies. So could I get 500 or 1,000 more megawatts into this area if I did a little small change, or use did more dynamic line rating, did some sort of grid enhancing technology that wouldn't raise the cost, And so in our mind, the open season idea could address some of the information problems, because you're saying, hey, listen, this is an area where we could develop 2,000 megawatts. It addresses the speculative project issue, because if you get in line, you're not speculative, you're putting up real money. And it gets to the right people paying the right costs. You know, I'm going to pay, if you know, I'll pay my share, and then I'll pass those costs on to whoever's going to sign that PPA with me at the end of that process, not at the beginning. So that's our idea.
Thanks for that insight, Arnie. That's really helpful. And over to Karen on the consumer perspective on what outstanding reforms you all are prioritizing.
Yeah, no, thank you. And a lot of great ideas out there that we've heard from my fellow panelists. I think, and this just doesn't apply to interconnection policy, but a lot of the policies that we're seeing, we need fresh thinking. The way the system was designed and planned, 100 years ago, just is not effective. And so we really need fresh approaches and fresh thinking. And if that invokes, what Beth discussed, doing a little bit more automation. We also need to be looking at resources for how they actually do perform. What are their operational characteristics? Before, everything used to be base load. It was 24/7. You had your fuel source and you were there 24/7. Generation looks a lot different these days. And so we need to recognize the different attributes that they have and how they affect the system. So we really need to modernize our thinking and not just plan and study like we used to. We need to really think about what are the generation resources, what are their capabilities, and again, looking at some of these cost measures, these new technologies that are cost effective, that should be put in use as we're looking about upgrade costs. Are there solutions that are less costly than doing enormous upgrades? Are there these new technologies, grid enhancing technologies? I heard, dynamic line ratings mentioned. These are some of the things that we really need to be thinking about as we look at the grid of the future. And then I think, the other point that I'll make is that this is just one piece of the puzzle and one piece that FERC is looking at. There is a large disconnect between what we're doing when we're looking at generation and interconnecting generation to the transmission grid and the transmission planning process, when the regional transmission organizations or any sort of transmission planner should be looking at, well, what's in the queue? And the queue should also be helping us in our larger planning. So what should we be looking at? So I think Arnie mentioned a little bit more about this backbone. So if we put a backbone system in, how does that help bring more generation onto the system? So the fact that these are kind of two completely separate processes, we really need to bring those two processes together and help them inform each other. Where is the generation located? Where do we need more generation? Where do we need more transmission? Where do we need upgrades? All of this should be informing each other. These should not be just separate, siloed processes, because then again, we're introducing that inefficiency, which of course raises cost to consumers. And there will be reliability gaps there. We really need a comprehensive rethink sometimes about transmission policy and energy policy in general. We can't do things the way we've always been doing them for the past decades. We really need to be moving quickly, efficiently, and we need to be really taking advantage of the newer technologies that we're seeing and more coordination among the policies that are coming out of FERC, states, EPA, all of the federal government. Everything is impacting each other. And so we really need a broader look and making sure that we're using the information that we have, either through planning processes or interconnection studies. We need to make sure that we're doing all of this in a coordinated, planned, informed way.
Wonderful. Well, so I kind of took away 4 general categories of that, and then we'll come to the 5th one here, which is a little bit more sort of Texas compared to the rest of the U.S. base. So one of the, to kind of recap the 4 bins, to Karen's last point there, and really a lot of points other folks made, like we really see a network upgrades problem that's kind of zeroing in on the type of upgrade that's a real issue here, and that's where you need the coordinated approach and not planning in silos or these incremental one-off bits. Sort of thinking about those in more of a geographic cluster format might be more efficient. So that's one. Number 2, a lot of folks hit on information, right? Information access is going to be so important to get developers that what they're really after in many cases is understanding where there's slack in the system and what those upgrade costs are at particular areas on the system to interconnect. 3, getting those like study assumptions to be better. So when you do issue that request, it's not just a black box. It's, you know, that those assumptions are going to be realistic. The assumptions are actually transparent. Stakeholders can talk about them and even challenge the grid operators on things like that. And that they're inclusive of a variety of technological options on the table for upgrades. And then 4th, kind of really looking at that like automated or process efficiency opportunities and improved data management. So those are sort of 4 like great categories, I think, on further reform directions that our speakers have hit here. The last one is sort of understanding, what does Texas do differently and why? And what extent can some of those lessons apply to FERC jurisdictional RTOs? So I'll start with Beth, given her background, but then maybe Arnie wants to jump in here too, because Vistra has a very active footprint in Texas, as well as the rest of the country.
So let's start with some unique characteristics of Texas, because that then informs the transmission world here as well. Texas is an isolated grid. So it is easy, in relative sense, it is easy to model the entire ERCOT grid, and there are no boundary impacts to manage. That just simplifies the problem. Let's go further and say, you know, Texas is a really big state with a lot of resources and a lot of open land. I'm reminded of one of the very first wind projects that was built in Texas had a 28-mile long interconnection line, single interconnection line that affected one landowner. So that I share that just to remind us that Texas is a really big place with a lot of open land. And so those are not transferable to most places, you know, east of the Mississippi. But what does Texas do differently? The other thing Texas does differently is we do not have any kind of requirement for an installed capacity, whether that's a centralized capacity market or a residual or a load demonstrating that they have capabilities. And that simplifies the generation interconnection process. We also 25 years ago now already litigated how we're going to allocate transmission costs. Loads pay. Simple, direct. It was litigated 25 years ago. Was everybody happy at the time? No. Did it go through all of the various litigation and appeals processes? Yes, but it's settled. All loads pay for all transmission. And so from a generation development perspective, we describe, if you're a generation developer in ERCOT, you bring your step-up transformer and you point to a transmission line you'd like to interconnect to. That it's as simple as that. And the process, the interconnection process, study process in ERCOT is, we call it a queue, but it's not really a queue. It's not, you're not lining up for a place in line. You're basically entering a process. And if you're a generation development and pass each step of the process, which means you've paid an increasing amount of commitment for the next level of study or the next level of information required, as long as a generation developer, you move yourself through the process, you'll get interconnected. Now, here's the deal. If you're a generator and you pick the wrong place to interconnect, the risk is on you. You'll be curtailed. That generator will be curtailed, will have made a bad decision. And most importantly, the risk of that bad decision rests with the generator, not consumers, not regulated rate bases, it is not socialized. That's the trade-off. And that's where those risks lie. Now, that works in a world where you don't have a requirement for entities to demonstrate that they have sufficient capacity. And that's one of the challenges in certainly the Eastern RTOs, and even to a lesser extent, SPP and MISO, where part of this interconnection evaluation is, are you connected enough? Can your energy get absorbed sufficiently so that your resource can be counted as a network resource for capacity accreditation as part of the capacity market? Again, my very first words were electricity is complicated, and part of that complication is the interconnection of all of these policies, and understanding how they interact with each other is important. So notice in my ERCOT diatribe, not once did I say, well, it's not because we're not regulated by FERC. That's not the reason for the fast process. It's one of just the natural geography of the place, and two, a very specific and very different kind of market design that we have that facilitates an ease of interconnection. That said, also, I will also say ERCOT's, I'll call it a queue, but ERCOT's line of projects that would like to be interconnected has gotten very large. And but our average interconnection time, if I calculate it correctly, is about 3.5 years. So it's not instantaneous, and it's a process. The other thing I'll talk about just as a process, one of the things I'm struck by is we've all been to a restaurant where you kind of have to stand in line to wait for a table, and part of that, frankly, can be by design, right? They only want to serve so many people, and part of the entire process is to queue people up so that they're trying to feed everybody and give everybody that right experience. And there's some similarities here to the generation interconnection process. An interconnection process that was an hour long, it doesn't serve, I don't believe would be appropriate. I think it's appropriate to have some process that resources or supply sources have to move through. The challenge we're having is that process has gotten very, very long and isn't meeting the other needs that we're trying to accomplish. So that's my diatribe on ERCOT.
I appreciate it, Beth. I think that's great. And over to Arnie for any quick thoughts on sort of the ERCOT model and its pros, cons, and its external validity for the rest of the RTOs.
Yeah, the one I think Beth makes a great point about just deliverability and capacity markets and those differences. Those are really, really important to appreciate. The other thing I just want to expand on is, Beth talked about if the generator picks the wrong location, then they're at risk. The one little caveat I'd say to that is, if you're an existing resource that's also in that same area, you are also at risk. So that person is going to add some risk onto you. And in our prep sessions, Beth and I talked about this a little bit. If you're a dispatchable resource, so you have a positive marginal cost, in that moment, it is efficient. It is more efficient for the low marginal cost resource to have priority access to whatever transmission is available. That is the lowest cost solution for the market. But if in that moment there's some renewable resource someplace else that is not running, and you would really like a dispatchable resource to ramp up, you might make that dispatchable resource unavailable to the market, and some other dispatchable resource that is higher cost has to dispatch. So in this kind of not accounting for making sure that everyone who is already there can still deliver to some place, you do potentially shift risk you do potentially make some existing resources less available to the market. There could be some cost impact, not just to that generator, but to the rest of the market in doing that. And you know, it's just one policy consideration to think about.
Thanks, Arnie. That's fantastic. We did get a couple questions here. They're a little bit more technical in nature, so I'm going to save that for the last part here. So perhaps just to do a quick roundup here for especially a little bit more of our high-level audience that might have to roll off at the top of the hour. There's a variety of institutions involved that can be involved with fixing the outstanding interconnection problems, right? A bit of added context for folks here is that Congress, of course, is teeing up another permitting package, and a couple senators are talking to each other on both sides of the aisle. There's also some consideration of, beyond permitting, do we roll an interconnection of this? And some of the consideration is, all right, well, we know that Congress isn't going to be making decisions on all these technical nuances, but they can categorically identify some of the issues like we discussed today and say, hey, FERC stakeholders, you got to fix these and do it expeditiously. And then, of course, there's things that FERC and even at the region stakeholder specific level, there can be some elements of what they can address too, although it's a bit unclear of how much sort of gas is in the tank at FERC to initiate some of these outstanding reforms. So I'd be curious, for a minute or two each, what your perspectives are on sort of the mechanisms to get some of these reforms done and what the role of each institution is. In no particular order, I guess I'll start off with, just to switch it up. Let's start off with Karen.
Let me get myself off mute. You caught me off guard. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, a lot of this does lie with FERC, and you did mention just sort of the capacity that they have right now. Staff is tackling a lot of things, but I really think that taking a more holistic look at all of these, to use a better word, interconnecting policy issues, I really think FERC needs to take some really bold action and look at coordinating these processes. We're still awaiting the transmission planning rule. I would hope to see parts of the reforms that they're thinking implemented into that transmission planning rule. Let's take a broader look at what's actually happening. And I know that, perhaps it's advisable to take little bits and pieces as you can, but recognize that all those bits and pieces do finally have to come together and make one comprehensive puzzle that actually works. And so I think FERC has a lot of work to do. And I think that they have the opportunity to, as they're taking a fresh look at transmission altogether. And generator interconnection is a big part of that. And so I really encourage FERC to take some broad action and some courageous action in some areas to really look at the big picture in putting all of these, tying all these strings together into, what do we want out of our transmission system in the future? How does this work with the generation that we predict or project will be available and coming online, those sorts of technologies. So let's let FERC be bold. That's my advice.
All right. Let FERC be bold. Maybe that'll be the headline takeaway on all this.
Hopefully.
Beth, since we got a chuckle out of you here, what do you think about what would tee up next reforms productively?
Well, I agree with Karen that some leadership and vision at the federal level is good and helpful, important. But I'm reminded that, again, transmission and particularly the construction or the rebuilding of transmission are people on the ground in specific locations in specific states. And that work can come under the purview of particular state public utility commissions or public service commissions. And that coordination between state and federal policy is a continuing and ongoing challenge for us in America. And we need to recognize that as something to be addressed. But I think the better place to do that is, as we talked about, that we have this this relationship between regional transmission planning. And if we could do regional transmission planning, taking into account what we're seeing in the interconnection queues, that could help sort of lay a groundwork that interconnection could then happen faster. It's that regional transmission planning interactions between the FERC and the state commissions, I think, is where the best process is. But we should remember that improving that has benefits for interconnection as well. So I'm just throwing a shout out for the states here.
Yeah, no, that's great. Arnie, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think we're all victims of our backgrounds. So I also think FERC is probably where most of this action is going to be. I would say I think Beth and Karen are exactly right. The interconnection between interconnection and transmission planning is going to be the key, one of the keys to figuring this out. The cost allocation part of that is, if this is going to be durable, the cost allocation part of that is also going to be key to getting this right and keeping this out of the courts, and moving forward with the policy. And I think our view is assigning costs to the cost causers as best as you can is critically important. And especially in a multi-state ISO, and Beth, and this connects up to your comment about the states. In a multi-state ISO, if one state believes another state's policies are driving costs and that state's not paying for them, or one set of consumers thinks another set of consumers is driving costs and they're not paying for them, that's when you stop losing that durability in policy. How do you crack that nut? In my mind, I would love to, it's not a magic wand, but really getting all of the interested stakeholders in one room and saying, okay, we're going to spend a bunch of time together, and maybe this is, several, I hate my FERC friends are going to be angry at me, but maybe this is several days of, or multiple, hey, here are the policy levers we have. Let's talk through the variety of perspectives on them and see whether some sort of common ground can bubble up. I think that is worth it. I think maybe a bottoms up approach to where the collective set of stakeholders might have common ground. And there's going to be some stakeholders that are going to just say, no, protect my incumbent, in my incumbency, ignore them. But the people who want to be constructive, get them in a room and see what you can get out of it. And I think that room probably is at FERC.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, there's sort of on the incumbency side, there's a lot of times inertia to sort of just letting the regional stakeholder processes. A lot of times we've seen some issues get traction, and we've seen others for a decade just get kind of stonewalled and not go anywhere. And that's a lot of times because of the way some of the governance dynamics work in some of those footprints. Casey, what do you think?
Yeah, so kind of on that point, I think, the cost and manage approach, having requests and projects identify like what level of deliverability or as like service as available that they would like is definitely one way to get it, kind of like low-hanging fruit. Some other processes that actually RTOs have been adopting and implementing even post Order 2023 or as part of their compliance is in PGM, you have a fast track approach where they're identifying, what's in the queue that doesn't actually have any network upgrades or minimal network upgrades. How can we expedite that in the same way that an energy only service model would work? Kaiser has also been identifying where's headroom on the existing system. Like, let's identify where that capacity is and have that separate process happen on, again, another fast track. So some of these different off-ramps that you can identify for areas with transmission capacity or areas with minimal network upgrades needed, so you can get those projects on a faster study and connection timeline than maybe projects that do want that higher level of deliverability for capacity options. So I think identifying like what are some of these separate processes that we can bucket out based on what projects are willing to take on for risk and what level of service they'd like. But of course, that's still, low-hanging fruit, the transmission system is going to, be oversubscribed at some point. We need more anticipatory transmission planning and programmatic approaches to addressing those network upgrades, and really more holistically think about, like, we're building gigawatts, we're not building megawatts. We need to be thinking about projects like replicating potentially the competitive renewable energy zone that Texas initiated, where they planned out, where is there commercial interest for development of all types of technologies. Let's plan out that transmission system in advance, and then kind of do a reverse auction in a way that minimizes overall costs as opposed to doing incremental build outs. And because you're building up the transmission system in advance, those projects have line of sight on like what that dollar per kilowatt cost will be. Use things also with SVP and MISO and their joint targeted interconnection queue process is identifying areas on the seam where they are going to have network upgrades and doing it in advance. So there is predictability on the timeline for that construction. There's predictability on the cost of what interconnecting will be based on what they've identified already. And so having more of those programmatic approaches that give product developers that line of sight on cost and time that is so crucial to getting financing for those projects is really what's going to be necessary. So again, transformational reforms. What can we get out of the existing system? What are some of those new technologies like GETs and advanced conductors and other transmission technologies that can get products on in a couple of years that don't require new greenfield development? And then what are those anticipatory and just maybe more robust planning processes to integrate? Because we know that there's lots of commercial interest. So how can we think about this in a way that aligns and really would advance cost-effective building solutions? And so I think that's very analogous to permitting reform on the Hill, and that in PJM, they have about 44 gigawatts of projects now with signed agreements for interconnection, but only 2 gigawatts, so like 5%, actually came to commercial operation. And many of those projects, it's because of siting and permitting issues. So many, again, analogously, procedurally impossible to build out these projects. How can we identify technologies with known environmental impacts? How can we identify areas where we'd want those projects to be developed, either brownfield sites, existing infrastructure, retrofits at point of interconnection, other areas that would want that development or are already disturbed, and how can we pre-clear technologies, pre-clear land to develop those expedited systems that really allow us to focus our workforce on the permitting side, or maybe on the interconnection side, on projects that need that extra attention and study and analysis. So I think really thinking about things in an anticipatory manner, how can we develop fast tracks, both for interconnection and permitting, that really accelerate the development of projects?
Thanks, Casey. I really like that fast track point, and that's perhaps a nice segue to a little bit more like incrementally technical aspect of today's conversation here. We've been pretty loaded up here with some questions on that front. Perhaps one that does get sort of at that policy, that institutional role question with like the technical fix aspect. Peter Crampton asked a question here on. Is additional FERC leadership even necessary, or will some of the regions just sort of, do they already have sort of like the tools, and perhaps implied in this is, do they have the motivation to address some of this? And of course, Arnie and I were kind of just discussing there about how that does get into some of the stakeholder governance processes, where this isn't unique to this issue set, but we have just seen a pretty chronic pattern in this industry where sometimes the policy fix is pretty obvious, or the process fix is pretty obvious, but no progress gets made for an indefinite time period because a lot of times of incumbent interest. And so there's going to be that piece of this, but also to Casey's last point there on sort of like fast tracking some elements, I couldn't help but think about some regions, and I know this came up in a PJM stakeholder conversation recently, to kind of look at fast tracking these types of resources that are a bit more like energy only. So they wouldn't qualify necessarily as a capacity resource right away. At that point that Beth was making of the distinction between, say, an ERCOT energy only type of interconnection process and distinguishing that from the capacity resource. But could you sort of fast track an energy only resource interconnection, and then also have them, get them connected to the system, and then also explore like the incremental upgrades to make them qualify as a capacity resource. So I'd be curious, turning it over to the panel here, on that technical solution set, but also the question of how well are the regions individually set up to go after some of these categories of reforms, or do you sort of need a push or some consistency from FERC to address these?
Well, let me start, and folks with a little bit more feet on the ground may follow up. I think we should point to, I think kind of the success of the MISO SPP coordination. They saw a problem they both were having, and they said, well, let's get together and see if we can't figure out a mutually agreeable solution through their joint interconnection process. And they've had various seams kind of transmission planning. I think there's a renewed sense of focus. I think there's now some, DOE funding going that way. All of that demonstrated that didn't happen because FERC told them to, right? Those were two regions coming together trying to meet a need. Yet to see the outcome of that, or yet to see the benefit of that, yet to see here's the key part, the acceptability of those projects being paid for. So that's something to watch. And in my mind, it all comes down to cost allocation. And Karen's really good because she wants stuff and she wants to pay her share of it, and that's good. But then it's, well, what's my share? It's the argument over the share. It's the argument over that can slow things down. And I can't emphasize it enough. One of the benefits of what ERCOT has done is 20 years ago, we had that issue and it is resolved, and here we are going forward. This challenge of, well, tell me what the projects are, and then we'll talk about cost allocation. Transmission is long-lived assets. They last for a long time. They provide benefits both ways. And one other aspect that I'll highlight from Texas experience, Casey mentioned the CREZ projects. That was definitely, that was back in the days when Texas politicians liked wind, and we had a coordinated process, and we built out transmission lines, and it was oversubscribed before it was complete. It wasn't a build it and wait for them. It was a hurry up and build it because we're standing in line. Those same lines helped provide the pathways necessary to serve increasing amounts of electricity in the Permian Basin in far west Texas, helped provide those benefits to loads. They weren't anticipated the decade before, right? But they absolutely were there and provided that benefit. Transmission goes both ways. And I think that's a helpful thing to keep in mind as we're talking about these long-lived assets, and what are the fair and appropriate ways to allocate the costs of them going forward.
Excellent points. Thanks, Beth. We also have a question from Ted Thomas, who's the former Arkansas Commission Chair and very active in MISO affairs, and MISO is certainly one of the ground zeros for this issue set. He'd asked a question on how the ERCOT interconnection risk profile works for new generators, and sort of how the risk of curtailment is allocated with this connect and manage approach. And for our audience, connect and manage is sort of like the phraseology for how the Texas system does it, which of course, compared to the more rigorous deliverability tests that other RTOs require. I think when Ted asked this question, Beth might have been in the middle of inserting some views on it. But one thing that did come up that I think is interesting, and I'd love to maybe put this over to Arnie, is that when you talk about generator risk management, there's a profound difference between how competitive suppliers manage risk, because you're in the business of taking RTO revenues and managing your own costs, and you're driven by the net revenues that you get there. If you're an integrated utility, you're in the business of building rate base, and actually everything you get in the RTOs revenue-wise and your operating costs all get netted through, typically in automated retail adjustment mechanisms. So that can profoundly affect sort of how the incentive for managing risk. So Arnie, maybe over to you to expand on how does that structural difference between the generators affect the management of risk and sort of the applicability of perhaps the paradigm that we have for interconnection in different footprints?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and it goes a little to the comment I made about in Texas. There can be this shift in risk to the existing generator, and there I'll say the one thing we've done like in Texas is now we're late, so I'm gonna feel free to get really wonky. There are these things that you can ask the transmission provider or the grid manager to do to kind of basically reconfigure the grid to allow neither generator to be subject to that congestion. They're called remedial action schemes. I'm nearing the end of my technical knowledge of what they actually are. I can tell you the ISOs don't love them because they're in the middle of an emergency. You're kind of switching things around. ERCOT actually got to the point where they wanted to prevent any more of them. So on the one hand, as a competitive generator, we were very active in identifying remedial action schemes that would free up our generation, basically at no cost. You're just kind of reconfiguring the grid. And we had every incentive to do that. And that was very efficiency enhancing. Even in that instance, when you moved risk onto an existing generator, when that existing generator had an incentive, we found lots of ways to do things. We actually have a project in New York where we voluntarily paid for a transmission upgrade to free up a generator we had there. So this is a little bit of the Coase theorem of, kind of whoever got the property, you just got to define who got the property right. And then at that point, someone will figure out how to do it if they have the right incentives. And I think the more risk is allocated appropriately, but transparently, competitor generators will find unique low-cost solutions. I think, Devin, to your point, sometimes if you're talking about a bunch of vertically integrated utilities, it's not, if my generator is not running and I have to build another generator, it's okay.
Yep. And that's going to be an interesting thesis for a lot of researchers over the next few years, I think, to quantify, plant that seed. Also love a Coase theorem reference. Did not think that would come up in today's conversation, but it's always a beautiful thing. But to get back to a couple wonky items on interconnection, I want to dig into, we have a couple questions here referring to like the study processes, like what can we do to make the study processes more efficient and identify true lowest cost solutions, and digging into the restudies and everything. I'd be curious for sort of that next level of depth on what you think could be done better. Open question to the panel on those study processes.
I'll start, but I think it's actually a lot of the things that Casey talked about. So I think the issue with the studies, it's not the studies themselves. So I think they probably can be improved, and there could be automation and better data. I think that like the actual conducting of the studies could be improved 100%. I don't know that I've got any great ideas for how to do that, but some of the things that Casey's talked about, which is just doing a better job of identifying projects that are not interrelated, so that you're not all collectively subject to the same sort of restudy. So kind of parsing things out a little bit better, finding fast tracks so people can get out of the grid, again, not be subject to the restudy process, and then or not have their success or failure drive somebody else's. So I think it is compartmentalizing more, and some of the things we've talked about, speculative projects, getting more of the speculative projects out will also reduce the need for the restudies, in addition to just the wonky functioning of the studies themselves.
Well, I'd like to add on to that a little bit, given that we're very late in the process. I'm going to go very, very wonky, and it has to do with and because we've talked about so many of the interconnecting resources, are inverter-based resources, which means that their connection and their synchronicity to the system is through whiz-bang electronics that sometimes the generation developers themselves don't fully understand. They just sort of pass stuff over from the software supplier. And we're fine. So what do we need? We need to better understand the guts of that throughout the industry, because there's some very real reliability impacts of that software and how it interconnects. And if everybody's got the same inverter manufacturer with the same software, what does that mean? That's a wonky electricity power systems problem that deserves academic attention, power system engineering attention, and something that we just need to, as an industry, need to be aware of as a thing that is becoming an emerging issue here. And the risk is, without dealing with it, the fear of the unknown, the answer is on the electricity side is always no, right? If I don't understand it well, the answer is always no. And so this is an area that we need to better understand, so the answers can be yes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Beth. And I think something else that Order 2023 did with regards to the study process is kind of identify like what changes to a project as it's going through the queue actually count as a material modification. So for example, if you're a solar project and you want to add a battery behind your desired point of interconnection, that doesn't change how your system performs electrically on the system. Historically, that might have caused you to go right back to the beginning, cause a restudy, but now there's a higher threshold for what counts as a material modification that can trigger these restudies that I think is going to address some of those churn issues within the queue. Karen mentioned it earlier, but also like realistically studying what a project's operating characteristics will look like. So solar and wind have very different generation profiles, assuming their full output above what the capacity factors actually are simultaneously, when we know that they're going to be peaking at different times of the year. That can reduce overbill that eventually gets passed on to consumers that's actually not necessary. So I think those are also two changes. And then, we say artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation, standardization. It seems pretty abstract, but we know that there's grid operators like SVP that's working with Amazon Web Services to really address some of these study process issues. And I think it also gets at workforce development challenges for interconnection, which again, we say workforce challenges across the energy ecosystem. But for interconnection, if you're able to have machine learning or automation that spits out this information in such a way that it reduces the technical need or technical training for the workforce, you therefore kind of lower the bar and how much workers and what level of training they have, which also addresses some of these study delays on that end. So I think there's a lot of ways that the process is going to address many different challenges within the system.
Yeah, and Devin, that sparked one other reminder to me that there are points where the generator developer and the study people are kind of arguing about assumptions, like especially for storage. So when is the storage going to charge? When is it going to discharge? 2023, I can't remember whether this got through to the final rule, but there's an option to say, if you storage developer are willing to commit that you're only going to charge and discharge in these hours, and then that's how we will study you. So for technologies that are harder to study, and in the prior interconnection reform, which I worked on when I was at FERC, there was also this option to say you can be studied for less than your total installed capability. So if you were solar and storage together, but you really knew you were never planning to inject more than the capacity of the solar resource, you could offer to be studied for less than your full installed capacity. Those kinds of things where you allow the developer to voluntarily restrict their operations just to move the study process along, those I think are really valuable incremental improvements to the study process as well.
Well, and just not just the study process, but the reliability of the system as well. Simple things like, well, it doesn't make sense to assume solar and batteries are going to do the same, going to do total discharge at the same time if your step-up transformer is of a certain size, right? You will be limited. Or back to your remedial action schemes or things like that, there are things that you can do at the site that says the output from the site will not exceed X. Those kinds of things can be implemented and therefore are appropriate to be considered as part of the study process and potentially then implemented in the field with acceptable reliability outcomes.
Yeah, I'm glad the reliability point got, was put back in there. We've seen a couple of recognitions within the reliability community of interconnection, just kind of mentioning it sort of becoming a more of like a pressing issue. And it used to be sort of an economic nice to have, right? We want to minimize barriers to entry, right? And in many ways you can kind of categorize it. Beth and I put it in our FERC comments of you have sort of informational, procedural, and financial barriers to entry that can exist in interconnection. So we need to think about obviously addressing the procedural informational bits, and then sort of that deposit question, Arnie, and the financial stuff is making sure that you provide an incentive for the commercially serious actors without creating a financial barrier to entry, especially for companies with a bit smaller balance sheets. And that's one interesting way to frame it. But what we saw with reliability community now is, we're seeing NERC, for example, make statements about like, wow, actually, we think energy policy broadly defined is now classified as a grid reliability threat. And Jim Robb, the head of NERC, recently made a statement of kind of clarifying a few points here, and said basically the inability to develop infrastructure in this country is becoming a serious reliability concern. And when you lift up the hood, it's permitting and interconnection are arguably two of the 3 or 4 biggest categories that are really concerning, that are those artificial constraints on new supply that are kind of like ratcheting up at the worst time, to Karen's point, while demand is resurging among industrials, and you have data centers, remanufacturing, electrification of end uses and transportation all hitting at once now. And so this issue sort of hasn't been making the progress on the self-resolution front that a lot of us had hoped for, and the timeline to get some fixes in place is getting a bit too close for comfort on a few fronts here. So before we wrap up here, I just want to give the opportunity for sort of closing remarks from our panelists here on anything you view on the technical to policy to sort of public service announcement front on this issue set. So I'll start with Casey, then go to Karen, Arnie, and Beth.
Yeah, so to kind of recap the summary of reform ideas that we think can address things in the near term, and also like lay the foundation for what do long-term fixes look like, thinking about the cost and manage approach and other fast track options of projects deciding how much capacity they actually want available to them when they interconnect. What are areas on the system that have headroom, and how can we communicate that to developers so that we're targeting and enabling projects to connect quicker when there's existing headroom, or the cost of upgrades or the need for upgrades is minimal. And then how can we think about these anticipatory transmission planning, or integrating interconnection and transmission planning more seamlessly, so that we're building out transmission and we're thinking about network upgrades in such a way that it is, achieving economies of scale and being cost effective, and being able to send a clear line of sight on what those costs and what that timeline for construction will be, to give developers greater certainty and investors greater certainty. And then analogous to permitting reform, how can we develop fast tracks for these clean energy technologies, potentially in areas that well understood environmental conditions, or where we're already saying, hey, go build here, this is going to be great for this community economically, in such a way that we can really expedite permitting reform for those technologies in those areas that achieve a lot of our our energy and decarbonization and economic development goals. And so thinking about how we can compartmentalize and fast track certain processes for goals that we all agree that we want to achieve and that are near-term priorities for us.
Absolutely. Fast track takeaway. I like it. Karen, what are your big takeaways?
Yeah, and just because I see we're at time, I'll be very, very brief, but really I just think coordination across the board. Let's have a comprehensive picture about where we want to go. Let's make sure the states are at the table, FERC's at the table, Congress understands. Let's make sure that we understand that when we do make policy, they will impact other aspects. So let's have a bigger picture and let's have a plan on how we move forward and understand how each player and each part has a recognized effect on what we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. Arnie.
Yeah, I'll expand on that and agree with Casey that anticipatory planning is going to be crucial. But to Karen's point about coordination, if the economic actors that are ultimately going to be making choices are not core and part of that anticipatory planning, we're going to build a lot of bridges to nowhere, and then waste time and money. Something we've talked about not having much of either.
Well said. And Beth, the final word.
I don't know. I'm trying very hard not to leave it on a down note, but it's a ubiquitous problem. And not just, I mean, it's not just a US problem. This connection and infrastructure is a problem being faced by electricity systems across the world. I just read a report from Great Britain that could have been written about any of our interconnections here in the States. And so what I don't mean that to be to say this is an intractable problem and everybody's facing it, but there is some help that this is a common problem. It requires some big thinking and big themes, but I'm not sure it's going to require the common solution that's going to apply everywhere. And so that's the challenge, right? It's a coordinated approach with the flexibility for the individual regions to do what makes sense for the specific activities that are happening there or the specific entities that are there and their incentives. So.
Thank you so much. And thanks again to all our panelists here, and hopefully our audience took away the problem statement and the sort of policy reform categories, but also the best final point there, the really nuanced best practices. This will be a work in progress that takes, probably the better part of this decade to work through. We just need to elevate this up. It's not a sleepy issue anymore. This has to be something that is top of mind for regional stakeholders, FERC, and even, getting nudges at Congress to fix this going forward. So each institution has a role. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to additional dialogue on this topic. Have a great week, everyone, and happy holidays.